Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here today. I mean, as Nish said, our focus at the developer is on placemaking, and we're really engaged in how to make the spaces between the buildings in our places more equitable. And I think, you know, it's really an incredibly timely conversation to be having, as many of you know, and we've got an incredible panel for you. So as the coronavirus epidemic and the Black Lives Matter protests have highlighted this week, systemic racism and discrimination is ingrained in our cities, and that lack of equity has been cemented into our built environment. It's not a new problem. Transport infrastructure, the policing of public spaces, from slum clearances of old, to the way our motorways have been built, to the colonization of our neighborhoods through gentrification and property development. And now we have the unequal impact of invisible killers such as air pollution and climate change. So it's been proven already how that racism in the built environment, in combination with systemic racism, has made COVID-19 so deadly. I think now we also have emerging ideas around how working from home and schooling from home, planning in government from home is highlighting the increasingly pertinent issue of digital participation in the city and equity in everything from city making to the future of work. So, you know, our right to space, our right to the city, who's the city for, what are cities for, democracy in the digital city. These are all things that we're going to cover for you today. My role here is obviously to help chair this panel and to take your questions in the Q&A session. My first job, though, is to introduce the panel, which I'm so excited to do. So first off, we've got Zoe Berman, director of Studio Berman. She's an architect, a university lecturer, and founder of Part W, which is an action group of women who campaign for gender parity across the built environment. Zoe's also founding director of her own design office that operates as a collective, bringing together experienced design professionals who collaborate on a project-by-project basis. And she's going to be our first speaker on the panel today. So Zoe, take it away.
Thank you so much, Christine. So as has been said, I'm an architect, I'm a director of practice, and I founded a collective called Part W, which is an action group of women working in the built environment profession who campaign for gender parity across the built environment. And our work is underpinned by a belief that in placemaking and design, what is good for women is good for everyone. So to first set out some of our campaign work in a bit of context, I founded Part W because I was feeling in 2016 and 2017 that we were seeing in politics a real sliding backwards in terms of human rights and instances of women's rights coming under threat. And I wanted to think more about what I as an architect could potentially do in some way to contribute towards addressing this. So I invited a number of brilliant women who are variously working across the built environment sector in engineering, in architecture, in placemaking, in design education, to start talking about issues that women are facing in relation to the built environment. And one of the things that we kept coming back to was the matter of representation and visibility. And we took as an example the system of awards and recognition. And we noted that the fact that when you look at the top 5 most highly regarded design awards that are awarded internationally, the data shows that just 3% of those big name awards have been awarded to female designers. Now, by coincidence of timing, we happen to be finding ourselves looking particularly closely at the Royal Institute of British Architects Royal Gold Medal, and that award has been awarded by a sitting monarch since 1848, and at that time it had been awarded to 3 husband and wife partnerships and to 1 woman, Zaha Hadid, in her own right. So we started what we call the alternative list, where we invited the design community to note brilliant women who through history have made, who have been overlooked, but have made an amazing contribution to the built environment. And we were looking broadly at female landscape designers, social reformers, commissioners, patrons, so on. So that was us looking through history. And the next leg of our campaign was to then push for change going forward in the future. And as the Guardian newspaper later referred to us as a very vocal group, and yes, we are. We agitated and we encouraged and we made people aware of this imbalance within award systems. So it was then an amazing moment when earlier this year, Yvonne Farrell and Shelley McNamara, the founders of Grafton Architects, were awarded the Royal Medal for 2020. So brilliant, a moment of change for gender equity within design. And this dialogue, of course, is really important within this to note that with the Royal Gold Medal for Architecture, no person of African background has ever been awarded that medal. So there's a lot still here to do around intersectionality and representation across architecture. And if I will, just for one more minute, to kind of then zoom out and to say, now to kind of talk just briefly about the impact that has on all of us. Awards and recognition are part of the picture of whose work is featured in press, who then is invited to participate in design competitions, then who might be asked also to publicly speak, and who in turn then might act as judges on awards panel and so on. And so we have this real imbalance here, this interconnected spiral of who is designing and who is making decisions about our cities. And that group of people is imbalanced in terms of gender, ethnicity, class, and so on. And why does that then, just to finish, why does that then prove a problem in the designing of spaces and cities? We, as designers, we will all bring inherently our lived experience into our design work, but if only a narrow band of people are writing design briefs, carrying out the designs, delivering projects, then only a narrow band of society is really being well served. So we have houses and homes, public spaces, public buildings, infrastructure being defined by a narrow band of society, and this has been noted by Christine, and I think we will talk about more. As we're seeing right now, the lives of people from BAME backgrounds are being disproportionately affected by COVID-19 because of the issues around overcrowding, density of living spaces, access to green space, and inequality that is laced through our systems. So just to finish, a key element here in equity within decision making is having that in designing, having that equity of decision making, and I'm really looking forward to talking about that in more depth with the fellow experts on this panel.
Brilliant. So I'm going to bring in now Pooja Agrawal, Program Manager at Greater London Authority. Pooja is an architect working within the city. She's the co-founder of Public Practice. Pooja has previously worked for architecture and urban design practices Publica, and we made that. She's a trustee of the Museum of Architecture, a member of the DSC review panel, and a fellow at the Institute of Innovation and Public Purpose. Pooja was nominated for the Planner's Woman of Influence in 2018 and 2019. So Pooja, do you want to take it away?
Thanks, Christine. As my bio says, I guess I've got quite a lot of different roles, and I'm going to talk about the Equal City in three different ways. The first way I think of influencing and creating equal cities is through policy. I'm an architect and I've been working in City Hall for the last 4 or 5 years. And for me, that was an opportunity to bring the kind of conversation of equality into all the different streams. So quite often what you can see is people talking about housing policy and housing design. People are talking about public space and public design. And then you have a sort of separate conversation happening around equality, diversity, and inclusion. And what I'm really interested in is how can the importance of equality happen at every single conversation. So, for example, when we're talking about housing and talking about housing space standards, do we think about how different cultures use spaces differently? Is that part of the way we design? Do we think about the process of designing houses? Who is actually being involved in participating in the design of buildings? So again, bringing these ideas of equality in the conversation of housing policy, we could say the same about public space. Who is actually using these spaces? Do they feel equal and safe for everyone, for, accessibility in terms of less able people, but, gender, violence, how are we actually thinking about these spaces being designed for everyone and how they're managed? Lots of private public spaces, you're not allowed to do certain things. And who does that exclude? Is it excluding young people? So that's really important to think about. You could say the same about markets or high streets. They are a huge source of a platform for local economies, especially for different SMEs, which tend to be people from BAME backgrounds. So are we supporting our markets in order to give people opportunities to test different ideas, to sell different cultural goods? So I think the conversation of equality needs to happen when we're thinking about every single aspect of policy. The second thing I think is really important, and I think Zoe touched on this, is like who is actually making decisions. I moved from private sector to public sector because I often thought as an architect I wasn't there when certain decisions were being made about where the funding should go. What is the project actually in the first place? You know, who is actually writing these briefs? As an architect, sometimes all these decisions have been made. So for me, joining public sector was that opportunity to really influence the city when the decisions were being made. And I also co-founded a social enterprise, not-for-profit, called Public Practice, which is about attracting architects and planners and placing them into local authorities. The fundamental mission of public practice is about creating high quality places and equal places. And diversity, we wouldn't sort of say public practice is about creating a diverse workforce, but it's something we do. And I think that's really important, is that diversity is sort of inherent in the process. So for example, our recruitment process has been designed very, very specifically thinking about the sort of barriers that people feel in the industry. And over the last, we've had 4 cohorts so far. And in terms of BAME representation, we've always had about sort of 20 to 25%, which is remarkably higher than architecture, planning and surveying, which is in architecture it's about 9%, planning is about 3%, and surveying is about 4%. So I think it's really important that it's sort of inherent in the process when we're thinking about diversity, inclusion and practices, and we do more than talk about it, but actually keep it inherent in the designing of systems. And then finally, I think it's really important that we advocate for an equal city. Advocacy is so important. I think Part W, what Zoe's been doing, is kind of crucial to that. I also co-host a platform called Sound Advice, which sort of started a bit like a therapy session with a friend and I, who we talk about really difficult, provocative issues around race and the city. And we use music as a means to sort of making it a bit more playful. And we've been doing that for about a year now. So those are my 3 strands to talk about more details. So policy, decision-making and advocacy. Thank you.
So I'm going to bring in Simon now. Simon Höher heads the Hybrid City Lab, which is the urban and public design unit of Berlin-based innovation firm 0360, and co-chairs ThingsCon, one of Europe's leading initiatives on building a responsible Internet of Things. Previously, Simon co-founded Knowable, a digital platform for open source collaboration in design and process, an annual conference on art, technology, and culture. Simon has a background in sociology, politics, economics, and philosophy. He's an alumnus of Seed Camp, the MIT's International Development and Innovation Network, and of the European Policy Center Future Lab. So Simon, I think it's great to have you join this discussion. We've kind of had designer, then we've had planning, and now I feel like we're bringing in the digital city as well.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And I'm actually very pleased and honored to be part of this conversation. So yeah, I'm working at the Hybrid City Lab, and we are based in Berlin. As you already said, our focus actually is in helping urban organizations to create fair and equitable places in the digital age. This can be within, but also beyond the city. And when I say urban organizations, I mean anything from public organizations to private organizations to civil actors. Basically everyone that is taking part in shaping the urban environment around us, and hopefully with a public good in mind. And I'm happy to discuss what that might mean. So maybe as a starting point for our work, we basically had this observation, which I don't think is particularly new, but still relevant, of 3 developments, namely the process of globalization, urbanization, and digital transformation. And while there's a lot of things to be said about this, I'm sure probably we can all agree that for one, it made things quite messy. It kind of questions many of the distinctions and ideas and notions that we had about and growing up with, even as a society. And this means things like global and local, digital and analog, public and private, human systems and natural systems, me and you, or basically us and them, and as you already introduced, currently black and white. All of those notions are, I think, at least challenged and at least disputed, and those distinctions tend to blur. And instead of kind of trying to kind of look and rediscover this certainty that we kind of grew up with, we figured probably this messiness is here to stay, and how can we take this as a starting point to even start thinking and working within the city. So instead of it's either or, we try to understand the city and society in general as a place of hybrids. So it's local and global, it's digital and analog, it's basically public and private, and in many cases, it depends on the context and the very situation where and when you want to draw that line. So that as a starting point for our work, understanding the city as a hybrid place, leads to us basically asking, and this is also that what I brought here is basically three questions that inform our work, but that also kind of I'd love to discuss with you. The first question basically being, what do we aim for? What do we, economically speaking, optimize for? I think we can all agree that we want more equitable, more fair, more just cities, but I think it becomes interesting once we look at a closer understanding about what we mean when we say those things. And what that meant in the past, how the notions of those words changed in the past, in the present, and maybe in the future, and how we position ourselves toward that future. What stand are we going to make when we talk about what do we mean when we talk about a fair or an equitable city? I think we need more places and opportunities to have these discussions. Actually, ThingsCon, you mentioned that. We actually reach out to practitioners, to designers, to those people actually building connected technologies, and to ask them, what does it mean to actually build responsible tech in public and in private places? What does even responsibility mean in the first place? So in many cases, I think this can lead to more questions than we started off with, but I think asking those questions is crucial. The second question that I kind of have in mind is, like, once we have an idea about what we want to do, the question obviously becomes is, how do we make it happen? So it relates to tools and methods and strategies. I think this is where experts actually can come in, from architects to urban planners, but also to social researchers and economists, to understand what systems are we building and how can we make sure that not only intended but also unintended consequences are on the list. I think prudence plays a big role here in understanding what implications our systems, our designs, our interventions in the city actually can bring with them. I think this dialogue between practitioners actually is quite healthy. Last year, we were invited to be part of the Eurocities network, which is a European network of more than, I think, 150 cities of actually public servants and practitioners who actually share their best practices in dealing with similar situations, especially in the current kind of crisis and scenario of the COVID-19 pandemic. This has been proven as a kind of valuable resource just to understand what decisions have others made and how can we learn from them. And then the third question, I think my favorite question is, after understanding where we want to go and how we get there, is always, what did we miss? I think the moment we start having these conversations and decisions, the moment we start engaging with organizations, we are bound to have blind spots. I think there's no way around this. The point of a blind spot is that you don't know it's there. It's not a blank spot, but it's something that you're not aware of. And I think the only way to tackle this, and this is why what everyone said before me very much resonates with me, is the only point to tackle this is open and diverse systems and bring everyone to the table to actually have a chance to discover our own blind spots by the help and by the kind of perspectives of others. I think the city is the perfect place for this multi-perspective network. And in a best case scenario, we can use the city as an ecosystem for organizations, networks, and groups to kind of help each other find our blind spots and be part of a conversation. I think that has to do with an active civil society, maybe even an active digital civil society. Pointing to a project in Germany, it's called the Prototype Fund by the German chapter of the Open Knowledge Foundation, which actually funnels public money towards open source public interest tech by actually hackers and the community people that tackle all kinds of social problems from their perspectives, from social justice to data ethics to journalism, migration, and so on. And yesterday we also talked about the impact of participation processes in cases like, for example, Tesla's next gigafactory next to Berlin, which also brings about this collision of worlds, even of global economy, local activism, sustainability, economic neglect, identity issues, and so on. So basically, I would really, first of all, hear your thoughts about these questions, and also kind of invite us all to kind of a new role as also professionals in helping guide those questions, like helping to have informed and deliberate decisions about what future we are aiming for, helping to actually design efficient projects and systems to work towards them, and kind of help all of us to kind of discover our own blind spots in doing so, by building a diverse network of professionals to do the work.
I think one question you're maybe missing from there too, which I think is an interesting and important one, is who pays and who benefits? Because of course we can have these ambitions, but I want to bring in Hanna, who actually might have some ideas around that as well. Hanna Harris is Chief Design Officer at the City of Helsinki. Previously, she was director of Artinfo Finland. She was the 2018 commissioner for the critically acclaimed mine building exhibition at the Finnish Pavilion at the 16th International Architecture Exhibition, the Biennale di Venezia. Prior to joining Artinfo, Hanna was a program director at Helsinki Design Week and the Finnish Institute in London. She has also worked as an urban researcher at the University of Helsinki and Aalto University, and abroad at the Universities of Cambridge, Westminster, Milano Bicocca, and the Sorbonne. So Hanna, over to you.
Hello, everyone, and good afternoon from Helsinki. Really happy to be with you. A bit like Pooja, I was thinking about the aspect that I very recently joined the city and a local governance unit, if you wish. So I previously worked with design and architecture across more the kind of doers side of stuff. So been working with the designers, various events, networking, putting stuff and people and ideas together and trying to facilitate stuff that comes out of that. And I've joined the city of Helsinki literally 2 days before COVID lockdown started, so I'm fresh in the role. But one of the reasons was why this was very motivating for me was the thing that Pooja was saying, that I really believe that cities can be places with huge impacts in our world, how we deal with this stuff and what role designers and architects can have in this equation. So a little bit of background, the city of Helsinki has approximately 10 years of history of working on a strategic level with design, following pretty much the 2012 World Design Capital year, and then stuff that has followed on from there, where we have quite seriously taken on board how we might be using design thinking, various design methods embedded in the city itself, looking at how we do stuff and how that stuff will become results that will make our city lives and life for everybody better. Now, of course, this is the second edition of the role. Helsinki's been one of the first cities globally to hire a position such as mine, and the really interesting thing is that it's a kind of horizontal position. So I will be looking across the city, across different sectors, where and how we do stuff with design and architecture, how that might improve what we are doing and where we're aiming strategically. And in Helsinki, that is very much about the whole topic of today. So how to make the city equal for literally everyone. So for me, the very interesting question here is to look at communities and how communities engage with the built environment, all the different communities that are in interaction with, in living in the city, using the city, visiting the city. And there have been various groups mentioned already. I'd like to bring one more into the discussion, which is very important for us here. That is children. I strongly believe making cities good for children will make cities good for all in the future. And of course, another thing that here, perhaps in Finland in general and in Helsinki is quite important is that idea of democracy within that, how democracy is played out in cities and how an idea of active citizenship emerges from that. One example, for instance, here we've been really strongly in Helsinki working with a very progressive, equal network of libraries in the city, how they use digital services, what kind of architecture will best enable that to happen, and for people of all walks in life to use those physical spaces as a kind of board, if you wish, a platform to engage with society in active ways. The new Helsinki Central Library Audi that opened just over a year ago, which has been a real kind of beacon for making the whole library network stronger and providing that space and symbol for something like that equality in the city. Or something else that we might want to talk about today, which is then again more the sort of methods and systems that we have for different communities participating in designing and thinking about co-designing, if you wish, what our built environments look like. So here, for instance, we've got a system where there will be participatory budgeting across the city, of which the first round is in production at the moment, and the second one about to start, in where, again, a big chunk of the projects have to do with the built environment. So there is a keen interest and will to participate in making our cities better together across the spectrum, from city centres to everywhere around. And these are the kind of topics we're generally working with here in Helsinki. And I think where we are right now in time, this is especially important. We are standing, literally looking into the future, that what the idea of cities and urban life in general is and where that might go. In the short term, of course, there's stuff happening around the world, how cities are dealing with what we are doing at the moment, where we are, how we can live, how we can spend our days, remain sane and healthy, and somehow have living in Helsinki. There's a number of stuff we've been doing there as well. Again, equality has been a very important guideline there. So looking at, for instance, how we can help the elderly across the spectrum, how we can make sure that all children have access to education in this situation, how we can make sure that there is equal access to public space and greenery across the city for everyone to enjoy, how we can, in equal measures across the city, again, help that very kind of core of urban life, small services, restaurants, entrepreneurs, so forth, find new ways of doing what they do and be part of that important fabric of city life. So that's kind of course, now what is the immediate task to do, and cities around the world are doing lots in that. But then, of course, there is the long-term thing, the whole idea of how cities will be designed and built in the future. And we are standing at a very important moment now, and in, of course, throwing into that, there is the climate issue, which in Helsinki we are taking very seriously and aiming at having very ambitious climate targets, which will still continue to be important. So great to be with you here today.
So I want to start our kind of discussion, maybe kicking off from this point that I think has gone through as a stream from all of your comments around participation. So it seems to be at the heart of a lot of these questions. It's about representation in the profession. It's about who's excluded, who's included, who do we optimize for, who benefits, who pays. But, you know, it is this participatory, and like Hanna's just said, we're on the edge of kind of a new frontier, both digital and with extreme challenges that affect communities disproportionately. So I don't know, Simon, you were really into posing questions to other people, but I'm not sure you answered those questions yourself.
Of course not.
So I'm going to throw it back to you first and say, before we kind of put some of your questions to the rest of the panel, can you have a go at telling us about who we optimize for, who pays, who benefits, and what are the keys to democratic participation in this instance?
Yes, rightfully noticed, of course. I just brought the questions. I think a couple of, there's lots of things to actually dive into, and I'm looking forward to that. But a couple of things that stood out is I also found this theme of representation, I think, kind of merging in all our work and thoughts. I think we can probably agree that this is kind of the starting point and kind of focus of when we talk about equitable places, to actually ask who are we actually talking to and how do we do so. I think one of the questions is, I briefly mentioned this, the questions of expertise and the question of authentic knowledge about actually the needs and the values that we bring to the table. And this is why I really feel, and I'm happy to see this happening, how these discussions are being led by more people, even though in like standard scenarios, you would say, well, this is a matter of planning, and then this is maybe a matter of kind of economics and so on. But what it touches on, and I think this also brings into the picture the questions that you asked, like who pays and who benefits, is basically a matter of power dynamics, a matter of knowledge, a matter of skills, a matter of language, a matter of structures, of even ways to afford to participate and to access in these discussions. I mean, it's one thing to say, well, we have an open table, why don't you all join? But it's another thing to actually have the resources to be joining. And I'm not just talking like financial, I'm just really meaning all kinds of resources that you need as a community to actually make your voice heard, to articulate it in a way that it can be part of this broader discourse, and also to have, at the end of the day, of course, the funds and the budgets to actually see your ideas actually coming to be. One thing that I think is direly needed way more than it is the case already is obviously transparency in that regard. I think to understand as a city, and by that I mean as a kind of city populace, everyone who lives there, how and where decisions are being made, how and where actually budgets are allocated, and how that resonates with whatever ideas have been brought about before, I think is one very crucial aspect to this. And maybe a final thought is, I think what I also really feel, and I completely agree, that cities are kind of one of the bigger levers that we have to shape the way that we live as a society. With this comes that, of course, they are not detached from all the global discourses and challenges that we're facing, even beyond just the city scope. Questions like identity, you already mentioned climate. We have racial inequality happening. We have many other kind of intersectional inequalities happening on top and underneath of that. So I think it really makes sense to bring in these discussions basically in both ways, to kind of inform a global discourse by the learnings that we have in local communities and neighborhoods, but also the other way around, to see this against the backdrop about what's happening. And I think this is already taking place right now, probably more prominent than we have seen it for quite a while. But I think this is a kind of a very important thing to take into account. As I mentioned earlier, the situation, just because it's literally next to us in Berlin, it's an ongoing discourse and a very disputed discourse about how and where economic development is going to take place, how and where big money, global politics, and these kind of issues are actually negotiated. Again, transparency comes in, but also I think other ways for communities to actually be part of this conversation. So basically this boils down to how can we not only invite everyone to the table, but also make sure they're actually coming and make sure they have a voice that kind of is heard and have kind of the resources to make their voice heard, other than just kind of saying, well, the door was open all along.
Well, Pooja, I'm going to go to you because I do think it's really worth talking about representation and kind of your work to get different voices into the planning and to the decision maker. So maybe you can talk a little, or maybe also just reflect on some of the other things you've heard.
Sure. I think I completely agree with what Simon was saying, that the issue here really is around power and influence. And for me, I believe that actually the public sector has a really important role to play when public sector, when it's done well. You know, it should all be about transparency. It should be for all sorts of people. And that's really our role as a civil servant, is thinking about who we're reaching out to, but we're also accountable to everyone. It's, for me, planning also gives you that sort of opportunity to think about sort of the short term, but also to think about what, you know, the decisions you're making now, what impact that's going to have in 5, 10 or 15 years, or sometimes often starting with that kind of long-term vision and then thinking about what we're doing now. often I think there is a bit of a tension between this idea of sort of top down versus bottoms up grassroots. And I like what Simon was saying about, this kind of the hybrid, and, what Hanna was saying about sort of participatory budgets. I think that you can sort of play these two ways against each other a bit too much. And, you can ask, and people I think can also idealize the idea of the community a lot. Sometimes you think there's actually quite a few powerful campaign groups, and when you look around the room, you're saying, hold on, are these people actually representing their communities, their neighborhoods, or are these people the people who have time and the resource to be able to do things in the evening, to do things during their workday, to be able to afford childcare, and therefore they can go into a planning meeting. So I think these conversations are tricky and important to have in terms of who you're representing and how you're transparent. I think that's a really important question.
Hanna, yeah, I do want to bring you in. I think one of the things I would like you to talk about, because I know you did some work on participatory budgeting, which I think would be really interesting to share around the money side of things, but also your general reflections.
Yeah. Well, first, a quick comment on the actually two points from what Pooja was just saying about that sometimes idealized version of the community and who is actually there to step through the door that is open. And what we're seeing at the moment as well is, of course, that actually we are finding varied voices because the channels have been increasing. So, for instance, the kind of regular sessions that we run in Helsinki for the transparency sessions about telling people what's going on, discussing with them about new building projects, about planning and so forth in different neighborhoods. And you do, of course, find situations where there might be certain voices that are very strong. And at the moment, just a few days ago, we ran an event, one of the kind of northeast areas in Helsinki, with perhaps 20 projects presented, and you would find a situation where there was a more varied situation of voices. Certain projects were being balanced quite nicely because there wasn't these like really, really sort of ones taking over. There was a very good equal mix emerging where we are also learning and taking on board how people are finding those different channels. But in terms of the participatory budgeting, so we've done one round, and the projects that went through in round one are in production at the moment. And what's been very important is indeed this point about, so if we have a system in place in Helsinki, it's divided into different geographical areas so that there's an equal balance, that you won't have projects going through just, let's say, in the west part of the city or only the city. There will be stuff everywhere, and you get the different kind of geographical, demographic, economic, cultural, and so forth mixes in there. But of course, we've done quite a lot of research already on stage one at who found this, how can we reach everybody better. We have people working on the ground who are called these, I suppose you could call them like the urban stewards and stewardesses, who are working with communities and finding a dialogue that then doesn't become kind of a top down, here's the door, come in, or simply bottom up, but it's an active dialogue from that point where ideas are first presented. Then we organize what you might call a kind of construction site, a kind of a hack, I suppose you could call it, idea hack, where people get to talk with then people in, let's say, the planning department, that I have ideas so and so. Is there something that we can really, how can we take this forward? How can we keep a dialogue going? That why do we in the community find this important? How can you help us? And from that stage, develop the idea, see how it might be funded, how does it work with other stuff that's going on, and all the way to the end, that realization that there's a two-way or multi-way, if you wish, process going on all the time.
So I'm going to come back to you. There's a lot to feed back on. I think, going back to your point about representation, about participation, but also about digital equity, which I know is something that you've been thinking about as well. So I'm just going to let you feedback on some of the things you've heard.
Yeah, so much to talk about, and so much to try and respond to in 4 minutes. So a question there, kind of at the starting point, was what do we do? And so there's lots that that my fellow experts have said some incredibly interesting things. I think something that I might just then plug is some extra 3 points that I might just plug in. What do we do? I think one of the things that we need is we need more data. We need more segregated data. We need more data that is showing us and data gathering, looking at the impact of design on people and how people are affected. And of course, so many people who are possibly listening into this will have heard of the way in which Caroline Perez, of course, talks about the need for gender segregated data and all these different intersectional information that we need. Because then, for example, when we were running our campaign, we actually part of our campaign was just pointing out the fact that in terms of design awards, only 3% of women have been given those awards, and you need all of these sort of statistics to be able to point at the issue. So we need more data, more information. I also think that we really need design to be much more part of the public consciousness as being something that is really important. And I think a lot of people right now are probably really starting to feel actually what it is like to have a poorly designed public spaces and green spaces, and what it means if you don't have access to outdoor space, you don't have a balcony, you don't have enough space for your family to move around, and so on. So the importance of design, I think, really has to be plugged in. And I'm continually surprised by the way in which designers are so often not part of the conversation. I was kind of listening in on the Financial Times boardroom conversation. No designers in there. No one from the construction industry. Prosperity UK conference. I was the only person, in this kind of high-level discussions about business. I was the only person there from the construction industry. So I think we really need design to be part of to be much more valued and much more understood as how important it is and how much it affects people. If we look at the statistics, only 13% of buildings in the UK have an architect involved in them, in that design at all. Globally, it's 2%. So what does that mean when we just kind of leave design out? So getting design as being something that's considered important. And then lastly, just one last thing I suppose to say is that we need people who are design champions. We need people in these kind of having these high level conversations in powerful boardrooms and so on. Who are czars and who are champions for good design. And we look at, and just to finish on as an example, the Welsh government, the amazing Sophie Howe, who is Commissioner for Future Generations. She's kind of reviewing all policy around what kind of impact does governmental decisions have on future generations. That is about climate change, it's about designing, it's about infrastructure and so on. So I think we need more expert designers at high level in the conversations.
Brilliant. Well, I think we're going to have lots to talk about in the Q&A. So I think the questions ready.
Absolutely riveting. Honestly, I feel like the common theme amongst a lot of our panels today has been collaboration and moving that across as different players come together on platforms such as this stage today here at CogX. My name's Anushka. I'm really grateful to our wonderful panel. A huge thank you, Christine, Zoe, Simon, Pooja, and Hanna. You've been amazing. I'm sure we've got lots of people that want to carry on the conversation. If you're signed up on the CogX virtual platform, please follow through to the breakout room for the Meet the Speaker Q&A, which is going to be kicking off in 15 minutes on the hour at 3 p.m. We are going to be back here streaming again live at 3 p.m. We're going to be talking about the rainforest with X Prize. Can breakthrough technologies save rainforests? So if you'd like to follow through the Q&A, if you click through the virtual platform at 3 o'clock, the beautiful panel chaired by Christine Murray from the developer will continue the deep dive into questions with you all. And then we'll be back here streaming here on YouTube and across the platform at 3 p.m. to talk about breakthrough technologies to save rainforests. Please do keep tweeting us with hashtag CogX2020, and we'll be back shortly after this break.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.